I just wanted to make a quick video showing some of the finished worm castings. This is taken from one of my worm beds. Little tiny composting worm still in here. But this is the finished material. I haven't really sifted it at all. We've got my larvae there. This has just been in a kind of open bag since I harvested it. So I use in-ground kind of worm beds. What I use is their greengrocers fruit and vegetable crates. I think they're around about 220 to 300 millimeters in depth, and they're 600 millimeters long, 400 wide, so they're about 16 inches wide, 2 feet long, maybe 10 to 12 inches deep. They come in different depths, and they're known as bale arm crates. They've got these carrying arms which hinge from the end so they can fold in, so you can stack the crates, or you can fold the arms out and you can nest the crates so they don't take much room up when they're empty. They're very sturdy, and what is nice about those is they've got kind of ventilation holes in the sides and in the base as well. And what I found in terms of surface area, kind of getting more bang for your buck, as it were, you can buy commercial wormeries from, I don't know, maybe £70, £100 up to probably £300, and a lot of the wormeries are just stacking wormeries, and they're a limited size. They're normally, I don't know, just under about 2 kilos, really. But they're a little bit of a trial just to kind of keep the moisture levels right and make sure everything's right, check pH and things like that. So it's a bit like having a kind of pet, really. So you've got to keep track of what the worms are doing in there, and feed them little and often, really. But these in-ground beds, what I've done is when I first got the allotment on, the paths are really massively wide. They're around about 5 to 6 foot wide, and they're all grass. There's that worm probably saying one again. They're about 5 or 6 foot wide, grass, and you've got lots of couch grass and perennial weeds as well, so trying to keep the weeds from invading in the beds. And I didn't want to go to the allotment and have to kind of mow grass, do edging, because that's a waste of time. If I looked at grass, there's a little tiny wisp. These are little tiny, I'm going to show up on the camera. Is he going to show up? Yes. It's about 10 millimeters long, about a millimeter wide diameter. Yeah, so there's lots of this grass, and I kind of did away with the grass and put woodchip in and raised beds, and then after about a year I thought, hang on a minute, my paths are still too wide. I made them about 2 foot, and then I kind of reduced them to about 14 inches, some are about a foot, just for access, more worms. Wormy. Put them all together. Yeah, so I kind of gradually chipped away at these paths and sort of thought, okay, now I've got more raised beds, and I put a polytunnel in. The polytunnel was 20 foot by 10 foot, and after arranging the beds from the former kind of allotment tenant's layout, I didn't actually lose any space, so I actually gained 10 foot by 20 foot of growing space, which is quite remarkable. So yeah, after about a year I've had this sheet mulch cardboard down on the paths to suppress the weeds, and I was putting lots of woodchip, really deep woodchip, and I noticed when I was kind of working with the paths, I thought, hang on a minute, the paths are building up soil faster than the actual beds. So it seemed quite backwards, so those are Beth's heads on the like this sort of habitat in their eggs. They're kind of like a wasp in it. They're quite effective, and they've got the same sort of agitated flight as well. He's just down here. He'll come back in a minute. It's just I'm sure you'll be able to see. It's just on the edge of the bag there. Yeah, so gradually reduced the size of the paths. Thought, hang on a minute, there's loads of compost building up on there. Loads and loads of lobworms working that wood chip down as it breaks down into the clay. And I noticed that the transition between the heavy kind of London clay subsoil and the wood chip, there was as it worked its way down, it was getting more and more black, and then there was a real huge population of earthworms just on that transition between the kind of nitrogen in the clay and then the carbon in the wood chip. So I thought that's quite good. So what I was doing is I was just harvesting the wood chip as it was breaking down, then putting that into a separate bin, and then as I collected lots of brewery waste, I was collecting brewery waste, and that's around about 300 kilos, 200 kilos a week, and then I think the ratio is about 50-50. The wood chips kind of dry, and the brewer's waste is very moist, and that's got the nitrogen in it, but I think the moisture levels seem to work out quite well if you're just doing a straight 50-50 ratio. So so I was kind of using the paths as a sort of pre-composting the wood chip just to get that carbon down a little bit, so it doesn't take quite so long to. But then I thought, well, I've got these worm bins that are not really that heavy. Catworm styles of snaking wormeries, and what I found with those, when it rains, because they're basically a bit like three sort of tapered-sided containers, when the prevailing rain gets in, they push through, so they've got a lock for leak chain or worm sieve, but I was finding it was just filling up with rainwater, and then it was just rinsing through the castings, and you're losing nutrients, and I don't know, some of it's leaf shape, some of it's worm tea, so it just seemed a bit of kind of losing battle in a way. So I thought, okay, what I'll do is I've got this area, massive areas, it's like even the smaller paths, they're sort of 8 foot long by 2 foot, so you've got loads of square footage there, as opposed to a little tiny 18-inch by 16-inch by 2 foot or whatever. So you get loads of those trays in the space of one of these paths, but really good depth as well. And because they're surrounded by sort of native soil, there's lots of aggregates and minerals and elements, and all these worms, they're all worms that have come in naturally, so they've got, there's that hoverfly again. So they've got basically everything they need, but I'm just adding the organic matter to keep them sort of happy and get them in that space. So I pre-compost the brewer's waste, the wood chip and the spent grain and the hops, and what does it look like? But this is the sort of this is really hot still. This is only been composted a couple of months. It came out the bin, I don't know if you'll be able to see, it was 76, it was 60 when I put it into the bucket, and now it's going down because there's only a small volume here, but it's still 55 going on 60 degrees Celsius, so that's way too hot to get anywhere near worms. And if you put this in a worm bin, you just actually drive worms away. They wouldn't go anywhere near it until it had composted further down, and then once the temperature's gone, the worms will move in on their own. But the wood chip I use, it's that's the kind of the biggest sort of size pieces. They're fairly small. Most of it is quite thin, almost like little shards of wood and twigs and things, and that stuff, it will break down quite fast. So, but that is why I fill up these after another couple of months. Once that's cold, and I'll give it another turn as well. I'll probably turn it or aerate it once a week, and then as the temperature drops off, once it's about 30, I'll turn it again, see if there's any heat left, and then that's good to put into the worm beds. But I'll fill you see this hoverfly. So once the bale crate worm beds, a little rove beetle there as well, once the worm beds are filled up with that part composted material, and in a way you probably could use that as mulch if you just put in a thin layer on the surface of beds just to suppress weeds, but it's a really good base for sort of worm bedding, and it's still got lots of food and lots of nutrition for the worms to feed on. So I'll fill up this bale crate with that up to the top, and then after a couple of weeks that level will settle down, and then worms will start moving in and just feeding on there and breeding, and you'll find cocoons and the smaller worms and mature worms as well. Once that's kind of settling, what I'll do is I'll take kitchen scraps and vegetable scraps and shredded garden kind of prunings and things, and I'll do a little surface feed occasionally just on there, just to kind of use that population of worms just to harvest that, to compost that material as well. And as well as the green waste, it's important to have a mix of carbons and nitrogen as well. So the carbons are things like paper and cardboard, shredded paper, old corrugated cardboard boxes, packaging. I also use lots of natural fibres, things like cotton towels, bathroom towels, kitchen towels, old aprons, cotton t-shirts and things like that. Basically put a moisture blanket over the top, and what that does is the compost itself retains lots of moisture, so it's got good kind of good habit for the worms themselves. And underneath these bale crates, when I first installed them, I put a nice generous 4 inches of woodchip as well, because I thought if there's any real torrential rain, then that will give a sort of little bit of a drain, soak away, and obviously that woodchip will eventually become worm castings too, so it sort of extends the capacity of the wormery. And when I put the bale crates, I use the woodchip around the sides of the crates as well, and if anything, these are basically buried under the ground, and I've got a scaffold boards each side, 2 scaffold boards on top, and then concrete pavias at the ends as well, and then at the other far end has got the raised bed. They're like an E shape, so it kind of wraps all around these beds. But I thought if there's woodchip around there, if there's any leachate or any kind of odours of things that might tend to absorb excess moisture and things like that, so it would make it less attractive to rodents and things like foxes and stuff. I didn't really want to draw attention to it, because one thing I noticed on the allotment, there's funny attitudes towards composting. The allotment committee themselves are really sort of set in their ways. They're quite backward, and I don't know if you start kind of mention worm composting and food waste and composting some of the stuff I put into the compost bins, they'd be like, oh, that's going to encourage rats. And, well, I can't see how you can possibly garden without actually doing any compost, because I mean, there's one thing about having green fingers, but if you've got green fingers, it doesn't matter if you haven't got any compost to grow stuff in. But yeah, so that's the result from the in-ground worm beds. But with compost, it reduces all the time in volume, so it's kind of hard to tell. I think I had 3 of these bale crates, and once it got to this stage, about a third of that had gone, so I was down to about 2/3 of the initial volume. So I bag it up into these woven sacks. They're the sacks that the spent grain comes in, and then I kind of store it in there until I've got time for it to dry out a little bit, and then I'll sift it. This has just been through a 1/4 inch rotary soil sieve, so it's I could probably go down to 3mm and just get the cast out, but it's probably, I don't know, maybe 90% worm castings. And the strange thing about this is that the worm casts themselves, when they're compressed, it retains lots and lots of moisture. So if you're used to kind of clay soils, that is absolutely, you can hear it's oozing with moisture, this is. But when it crumbles up again, it just goes back to the same kind of friable cast. So it's amazing stuff. I think it was one of the 1970s, 80s gardeners world, maybe Peter Seabrook or Percy Gray said, "Oh, it's good enough to put on toast." And in a way, this is like so nice. It's got, obviously the large volume of this is from woodchip and brewer's waste and spent hops, but then there's vegetable waste. I use biochar. I've got activated charcoal in here, which is funny because it totally changes once it's been through the cycle with the worms. Eggshells, I've only found a few bits, but I sometimes I grind it up, sometimes I just leave it as big bits, and because it goes through a compost bin and it's aerated and it's agitated, it all kind of reduces in the end. There's little bits of grit and gravel, because I've obviously had some plants and things, I've taken out root balls and popped them back in. But this is the bag, and it's about I think it's about 25 kilos. I've used a lot of it to make containers. When I use the castings, I probably do about 15% along with my existing compost. But a couple of additives I use. Some people don't like this stuff, I kind of like it. What it does is once it's in the castings, and castings can kind of compact down, will retain a lot of moisture, so I add a little bit of perlite into it, and it just kind of keeps it really aerated even more so. That's good for drainage, and the other thing I use is a little bit of vermiculite. Vermiculite does basically does the opposite from perlite. That holds on to moisture, whereas perlite is for drainage really. So it's basically just trying to get the ratios. Well, possibly for a sort of small trug, I kind of use the compost scoops. I do 3 compost scoops of compost, 1 compost scoop of Wormcast, and then a handful of perlite and a handful of vermiculite. Sometimes I might do a bit more compost. Just depends what I'm growing really. And in my beds as well, I like to have a little bit of, because there's still lots of cocoons in here and there's lots of worms in there. Even though this is basically mature cast, that can still provide a habitat for quite a lot of worms. There'll be little tiny bits of organic matter, and the worms will actually eat the castings a multitude of times as well, taking out, processing it down further and further.